This story is titled, Let My Deadbeat Brother and His Pregnant Wife Stay. Now she wants me to leave my own home. Hey everyone, if you're enjoying these stories and want to support the channel, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It helps me bring you even more awesome content like this. Now let's start the video. OP starts by saying, 5 years ago, my mom passed away and left me the family home. It's a cozy 3-bedroom house in a good neighborhood, and honestly, it's been my sanctuary since I moved back in. I also inherited a chunk of cash, which has been a lifesaver. I didn't have to worry about a mortgage, and I was able to do some renovations to make the place feel like my own. It's the house I grew up in, so there's a lot of sentimental value too. I wish I could say that life was perfect after that, but things got messy pretty fast, mainly because of my half-brother Blake. Blake and I share the same dad, but we're very different people. He's the type who can't keep a job for more than a few months, always has some excuse for why things don't work out, and hops from one girlfriend to another like it's a hobby. He's been like this for as long as I can remember. Our dad passed away a couple of years before Mom, and Blake used that as another reason to let his life spiral. He'd call me up every now and then with some new sob story about how life was unfair, and I'd always try to be supportive because, well, he's family. Things took a turn about a year and a half ago. Blake got evicted from his apartment because he wasn't paying rent. He called me in a panic, saying he had nowhere to go and needed help. At first, I was hesitant. I knew how Blake operated. He'd take advantage of my kindness if I let him. But then he hit me with the guilt trip. You're all I've got left. If Mom were still here, she'd want you to help me. That one stung because he wasn't wrong. Mom always tried to keep us close, even when Blake was being a screw-up. So, I caved. I told him he could stay with me for a little while until he got back on his feet. Big mistake. Blake moved in with just a couple of bags and immediately made himself at home. At first, it wasn't too bad. He was on his best behavior, probably because he didn't want to get kicked out. He even helped out around the house a bit, which shocked me. But as the weeks turned into months, the cracks started to show. Blake's temporary stay turned into a permanent arrangement. He wasn't paying rent, wasn't helping with bills, and wasn't even trying to find a job. Every time I brought it up, he'd have some excuse. I'm looking, but no one's hiring right now. Or, I just need a little more time to get my head straight. Meanwhile, he was spending most of his days watching TV, playing video games, or hanging out with his friends. I should have kicked him out right then and there, but I didn't. I kept telling myself that he'd get it together eventually. Plus, I felt guilty about the idea of throwing my only family out on the street. Then Blake got himself a new girlfriend, Jenna. I didn't think much of it at first because, honestly, Blake always had a new girlfriend. But this one was different. She stuck around longer than the others, and before I knew it, she was practically living at my house too. She was over all the time, eating my food, using my utilities, and acting like she owned the place. It was irritating, but I didn't say anything because I didn't want to start a fight. Things escalated when Jenna got pregnant. Blake called me one night, sounding panicked, and told me the news. I wasn't sure how to react. On one hand, I was happy for him because maybe this would be the kick he needed to grow up. On the other hand, I was worried because Blake could barely take care of himself, let alone a baby. When Blake told me he and Jenna were getting married, I didn't know what to say. It felt rushed. They'd only been together for a few months, and Blake hadn't exactly been the poster child for stable relationships. But he insisted that it was the right thing to do for the baby. I didn't argue because, honestly, it wasn't my business. If he thought marrying Jenna would make things better, who was I to say otherwise? The ceremony was small and quick, just a courthouse thing with a couple of friends as witnesses. I wasn't even invited, which stung a little, but I didn't let it show. Blake and Jenna showed up at the house later that day, grinning like they'd just won the lottery. Blake asked if Jenna could move in permanently now that they were married. He said it would be better for the baby, and they'd need the extra room for all the stuff that comes with having a kid. At first, I hesitated. My house wasn't exactly cramped, but adding another person, especially a pregnant one, was going to change things. Plus, Jenna had already been rubbing me the wrong way. She wasn't outright rude back then, but there was this air about her, like she thought she was better than me. Still, Blake was family, and I didn't want to be the bad guy who refused to help. So I said yes. That was mistake number 2. Jenna officially moved in a few days later, and from day one, things started to shift. She acted like she owned the place. She'd leave her stuff all over the living room, rearrange things in the kitchen, and complain about the way I kept the house. She even made a snarky comment about my furniture, saying it was a bit outdated. At first, I tried to brush it off. I figured she was just settling in and maybe feeling a little out of place. But her attitude only got worse. She started making demands, like asking me to cook dinner for her and Blake, or run errands for her because she was too tired. I was already letting them live in my house rent-free, and now I was expected to be their personal chef and delivery service? The worst part was how she treated me. Jenna had this way of talking down to me, like I was some kid who didn't know how to run a household. She'd make passive-aggressive comments about how things would be so much better once the baby arrived, implying that my house wasn't good enough for them. Blake, of course, didn't see a problem. Whenever I brought it up, he'd shrug and say, "She's pregnant, man. Cut her some slack." That excuse was starting to wear thin. Then came the big announcement. One evening, Jenna sat me down like she was about to have a serious conversation. I thought she was going to apologize for how she'd been acting or maybe talk about their plans for moving out once the baby arrived. But no, she had something else in mind. "We've been talking," she said, glancing at Blake, who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. "And with the baby coming, we think it's best if you find somewhere else to live." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline, but it never came. "Excuse me?" I said, trying to keep my cool. "Well," she continued, "it's just that we need the space. It's going to be really awkward having you here with a newborn. Don't you think it would be better for everyone if you found your own place?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Jenna, this is my house," I said, as calmly as I could. She blinked, like the words didn't compute. "Yeah, but Blake said it was inherited, so it's his too. And since we're married, that makes it mine as well. It's just weird, you know? Living with your husband's brother and a baby." That's when it hit me. She thought Blake owned the house. I turned to him, waiting for him to jump in and correct her, but he just sat there, avoiding eye contact. "Blake doesn't own this house," I said, looking back at Jenna. "I do. I inherited it when my mom passed away. You two are living with me, not the other way around." Jenna's face turned red. "What are you talking about?" she snapped. "Blake said—" "Blake lied," I interrupted. "This house is mine. You and Blake have no claim to it." She looked at Blake, who finally mumbled, "I didn't lie. I just didn't correct her." Jenna didn't say another word. She stood up, stormed off to their room, and slammed the door. I sat there for a few minutes, trying to process what had just happened. I couldn't believe Blake had let her believe the house was his. What was his plan? To just keep the lie going forever? After Jenna stormed off to their room, I thought things might settle down. I assumed she just needed some time to process the fact that Blake didn't own the house, and that they'd been living on my goodwill this whole time. But nope, I was way off. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of shouting. Jenna and Blake were already at it, their voices loud enough to carry through the walls. At first, I tried to ignore it. It wasn't the first time they'd argued, and I doubted it would be the last. But then I heard my name. "Why would you let me think you owned the house, Blake? Do you know how embarrassing this is? Your brother basically called me a freeloader," Jenna shouted. I couldn't make out Blake's response, but whatever he said only made her angrier. She stormed out of their room, slamming the door behind her, and nearly ran into me in the hallway. "Good morning," I said awkwardly, trying to diffuse the tension. Jenna glared at me. "You didn't have to humiliate me like that. You could have just gone along with it." I was floored. "Humiliate you? Jenna, this is my house. Did you seriously think you had the right to kick me out of my own home?" "Well, Blake made it sound like the house was his," she snapped. "How was I supposed to know?" I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Look, I'm sorry if this came as a shock, but the fact is, Blake doesn't own this house. I do. And I'm not going to let anyone, family or not, tell me I need to leave my own home." She didn't respond, just muttered something under her breath and went into the kitchen. I could hear her slamming cabinets as she made breakfast, and I figured it was better to give her some space. But the drama didn't stop there. Later that evening, Blake came to talk to me. I could tell he was uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, like a kid about to confess to breaking a window. "Hey man," he started. "We need to talk about what happened." I crossed my arms and leaned against the doorframe. "Go ahead." "So, Jenna's pretty upset," he said, scratching the back of his neck. "I think maybe you could have handled things differently." "Handled things differently? Blake, are you serious? She tried to kick me out of my own house." "Yeah, but you didn't have to tell her like that," he argued. "You could have just let her think—" "Let her think what? That you own this place? That she has some kind of claim to it? No, Blake. I'm not going to lie to protect your ego. This is my house, and you both need to respect that." Blake looked annoyed but didn't say anything else. Instead, he just walked away, muttering something about how I was making things harder than they needed to be. That night, Jenna packed a bag and left to stay with her mom. She didn't say goodbye, didn't explain, just walked out the door. Blake didn't go after her, but I could tell he was pissed. He spent the rest of the evening sulking in the living room, flipping through channels on the TV without actually watching anything. The next day, things got even worse. Blake was clearly still stewing about the whole situation, and he wasn't shy about letting me know it. "This is all your fault, you know," he said as I walked into the kitchen for breakfast. I raised an eyebrow. "My fault? How is this my fault, Blake? If you'd just gone along with it, none of this would have happened. Jenna wouldn't have left, and things would have been fine." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Blake, you let your wife think you owned this house, you lied to her, and now you're mad at me for telling her the truth? That's on you, not me." Blake rolled his eyes. "You're so selfish, man. You don't care about anyone but yourself." That was the last straw for me. Selfish? I've let you live here rent-free for over a year, Blake. I've covered your bills, put up with your crap, and now you're calling me selfish? You're unbelievable. He didn't have a response to that, just grabbed his coffee and went back to sulking. I thought maybe the fight with Jenna would be the wake-up call Blake needed, but instead, he doubled down. A couple of days later, he came to me with a new argument. "I've been living here for over a year," he said, crossing his arms like he was about to lay down the law. "That gives me some rights, you know." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "Rights? Blake, what are you talking about? Legally, you can't just kick me out," he said smugly. "I've been here long enough that I'm considered a tenant, even if I'm not paying rent. You can't make me leave." I couldn't believe the audacity. "So, let me get this straight. You've been freeloading in my house for over a year, and now you think you have the right to stay here against my will?" He shrugged. "I'm just saying, you might want to think twice before trying to throw me out." That was the moment I realized just how far gone Blake was. He wasn't going to leave on his own, and he clearly didn't appreciate everything I'd done for him. If he wanted to play this game, fine. I'd play it too, but on my terms. After Blake's little "I have rights" speech, I realized this wasn't going to resolve itself peacefully. He was digging his heels in, and I was done letting him walk all over me. I started researching tenant laws and found out that he was technically right. Since he'd been living there for over a year, I couldn't just tell him to leave. I had to go through the proper legal channels to evict him. It felt ridiculous. This was my house, the home I grew up in, and now I had to jump through hoops just to get my freeloading half-brother out. But if that's what it took, so be it. I sat Blake down the next day to try one last time to resolve things without involving the law. "Blake," I said, "this isn't working anymore. You need to move out. I'll give you some time to figure things out, but I can't keep letting you live here rent-free. You're about to have a baby. You need to get your act together." He just laughed. "Where am I supposed to go? I don't have the money for a new place, and Jenna's not going to let me stay with her mom forever. You're my brother. You're supposed to help me." "I've been helping you for over a year," I shot back. "I gave you a place to stay when you had nowhere else to go. But instead of using that time to get back on your feet, you've been taking advantage of me. I can't do it anymore." Blake rolled his eyes. "Whatever, man. You can't kick me out anyway. I've got rights, remember?" I could feel my blood boiling, but I kept my cool. "Fine. If that's how you want to play it, I'll go through the legal process. But one way or another, you're leaving." That evening, I filed the paperwork to start the eviction process. It felt weird, evicting my own brother, but he'd left me no choice. I also reached out to a lawyer to make sure everything was in order. I wasn't about to risk Blake finding some loophole to stay longer. When Blake found out, he was furious. He accused me of betraying him, of being heartless, of not caring about family. "You're kicking me out when I'm about to have a baby," he yelled. "What kind of person does that?" I didn't take the bait. What kind of person takes advantage of their brother's kindness and then tries to claim they have the right to stay in his house without paying a dime? I shot back. The next couple of weeks were hell. Blake alternated between guilt-tripping me and outright hostility. One minute he'd be apologizing and saying he'd try harder, and the next he'd be yelling about how I was ruining his life. I stuck to my guns, though. I wasn't going to let him manipulate me anymore. The turning point came when Jenna showed up one evening. She'd been staying at her mom's since the fight, but now she was back, and she wasn't happy. "Do you know what you're doing to my family?" she snapped as soon as she walked in. "Blake's stressed out. I'm stressed out. And this is the last thing we need with a baby on the way. Can't you just let us stay until we figure something out?" I took a deep breath. "Jenna, I understand this is a tough situation, but I've been more than patient. I've given you both plenty of time to get your lives together, and instead of doing that, you've both been taking advantage of me. I can't keep supporting you at my own expense." "Taking advantage of you?" she scoffed. "We're family. That's what family does. They help each other. Family doesn't lie and act entitled to something that isn't theirs," I said firmly. "This is my house and I've made my decision. You have 2 weeks to figure things out." Jenna didn't have a response to that. She just shook her head, grabbed some of her stuff, and left again. Blake, of course, was furious when he found out about the 2-week notice. "You're really doing this?" he yelled. "You're really throwing me and my pregnant wife out on the street?" "You had over a year to get your life together, Blake," I said. "This isn't my fault. It's yours. You made bad choices, and now you're dealing with the consequences." He stormed off, slamming the door behind him, and spent the rest of the night sulking in his room. Over the next few days, Blake tried everything to get me to change my mind. He called up relatives to guilt-trip me, saying I was abandoning him in his time of need. He even had a couple of friends reach out to me, telling me I was being unfair. But I stood firm. I'd been more than fair to Blake, and it was time for him to grow up. After weeks of back and forth, guilt trips, and arguments, I finally reached the end of my patience. Blake had made it clear that he wasn't planning on leaving willingly, and I wasn't about to let him bully me into backing down. So, I did what I had to do. I handed him a formal legal notice. It wasn't an easy decision. Evicting your own brother feels wrong on so many levels, but Blake had forced my hand. I explained to him that, legally, he had 2 weeks to vacate the premises. If he didn't, I'd have to escalate things to the courts, and that was something I really didn't want to do. When I handed him the notice, he laughed. "You're seriously doing this? You're kicking out your own brother?" "Yes, Blake," I said firmly. "I've given you plenty of chances to turn things around, and you've done nothing but take advantage of me. This is my home, and I've worked hard to take care of it. You can't just waltz in here, claim you have rights, and expect me to roll over." He crumpled up the paper and threw it on the floor. "You're unbelievable. Do you even care about family? About my baby? What am I supposed to do now?" I picked up the paper and handed it back to him. "Figure it out, Blake. You're about to be a father. It's time to start acting like one." The next 2 weeks were tense. Blake spent most of his time sulking in his room or complaining loudly to anyone who would listen. He even tried to bring Jenna back into the house, but I shut that down immediately. "She's not moving back in, Blake. You both need to focus on finding a place of your own." Of course, he tried every trick in the book to delay the inevitable. He called relatives to badmouth me, saying I was throwing him and his pregnant wife out onto the streets. A few of them reached out, trying to guilt-trip me into letting him stay. "He's your brother," one of my aunts said. "You can't just abandon him like this." I calmly explained the situation. How Blake had been living rent-free for over a year. How he'd lied to Jenna about owning the house. And how he'd refused to take responsibility for his life. "I've done more than enough for him," I told her. "At some point, you have to draw the line." The funny thing was, most of the family didn't even offer to take him in. They were quick to criticize me, but not so quick to step up and help. Typical. As the deadline approached, Blake got more desperate. He started making promises he couldn't keep. "Just give me a little more time," he begged. "I'll start paying rent. I'll get a job. I'll do whatever you want, man." I shook my head. "You've been saying that for over a year, Blake. I'm done waiting. The notice stands. You have until the end of the week to leave." When the last day arrived, I honestly wasn't sure if he'd actually go. Part of me expected him to dig his heels in and force me to take him to court. But to my surprise, he started packing. It wasn't exactly graceful. He threw his stuff into garbage bags and muttered curses under his breath the whole time. But at least he was leaving. By the evening, Blake was gone. He didn't say goodbye, didn't thank me for all the time I'd let him stay, and didn't even look back as he walked out the door. He just left, slamming the door behind him like a petulant teenager. The house felt strangely quiet after he left. For the first time in over a year, I had my home back. No more arguing, no more freeloading, no more drama. It was a relief, but it was also bittersweet. As much as Blake had driven me crazy, he was still my brother. Kicking him out felt like cutting ties, and I wasn't sure if we'd ever be able to rebuild our relationship after this. A couple of weeks later, I heard through the grapevine that Blake and Jenna were staying with one of her relatives. I don't know how long that arrangement will last, but I hope it gives them the wake-up call they need to get their lives together. Final update, ... It's been about a year since Blake left my house, and honestly, life has been peaceful. I haven't heard much from him directly, which is by design. I blocked him on everything the day he left. But of course, news travels fast in our family, especially when it's about drama, so I've gotten a few updates from relatives. Apparently, after I kicked him out, Blake and Jenna moved in with one of her relatives. That arrangement didn't last long. From what I heard, Jenna got fed up with Blake's lack of ambition and refusal to step up as a husband or soon-to-be father. I guess freeloading doesn't go over well when it's not family footing the bill. The baby was born a few months after they left my house. A little girl. I'll admit, part of me feels bad for my niece. She didn't ask to be born into this mess, and knowing Blake and Jenna, I doubt she has much stability in her life. Anyway, The big drama came when Jenna filed for divorce. Turns out Blake didn't magically turn into a responsible adult once the baby arrived. Shocking, I know. He couldn't hold down a job, barely helped with the baby, and was still blaming everyone else for his problems. Jenna finally had enough and kicked him out. From what I've been told, she's staying with her mom and focusing on raising their daughter, while Blake is couch hopping again. I heard he tried to move back in with one of his old girlfriends. But that didn't last long either. A few months ago, Blake tried reaching out to me. I got a message request on one of my social media accounts. He must have made a new profile after I blocked his old one. The message was the usual Blake nonsense. Long-winded, full of excuses, and dripping with guilt tripping. He said he missed his big brother and wanted to patch things up. He blamed Jenna for their divorce, said he was going through a rough patch, and asked if he could stay with me again. Just for a little while. I didn't even respond. I blocked the new account immediately. That didn't stop him from trying, though. Over the next few weeks, he sent messages through different accounts, trying to get my attention. Each one was more desperate than the last. He said things like, "You're the only family I have left, and I swear I'll change this time." But I've heard it all before. Blake doesn't change. He just finds new ways to drag people down with him. The final straw came when one of our relatives called me. Apparently, Blake had been crying to them about how I'd abandoned him in his time of need. They asked me why I couldn't just give him another chance. "He's your brother," they said, as if that excused everything. I laid it all out for them. I told them how I gave Blake over a year to get his act together, how he lied about owning my house, how he let Jenna try to kick me out of my own home, and how he showed zero appreciation for everything I'd done for him. "I've done more than enough for Blake," I told them. "If you think he deserves another chance, you're welcome to take him in. But I'm done." That shut them up pretty quickly. Funny how people are always so quick to tell you to forgive and forget, but when it comes to stepping up themselves, they're nowhere to be found. Blocking Blake was the best decision I've made in a long time. For the first time in years, I feel like I can actually focus on myself without someone else's drama dragging me down. Do I feel bad about cutting him off? Honestly, not really. Blake made his choices, and now he's dealing with the consequences. I gave him more chances than he deserved, and all he did was take advantage of me. At some point, you have to stop letting people use you, even if they're family. As for Jenna, I don't have much sympathy for her either. She wasn't exactly a saint while she was living in my house, and she made her fair share of entitled demands. But at least she had the sense to leave Blake when it became clear he wasn't going to change. I hope for my niece's sake that Jenna gets her life together and gives that little girl the stability she deserves. So that's the update. Blake is still Blake, jobless, directionless, and blaming everyone else for his problems. He's tried reaching out multiple times, but I've blocked him every single time. I'm done being his safety net. If he ever truly turns his life around, maybe I'll reconsider. But until then, I'm keeping my distance. Life is too short to waste on people who don't value you or your efforts. For now, I'm just going to enjoy my quiet, drama-free home and focus on myself. After everything I've been through, I think I've earned it.